At a quiet family funeral, a stray dog sits by the coffin and won't budge. When the dog's behavior becomes increasingly frantic, the family opens the coffin, only to uncover a shocking truth about the deceased's final moments. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The autumn wind swept through Cedar Grove Cemetery, carrying fallen leaves across the gathering of black-clad mourners. Sarah Thompson stood at the front of the crowd, her posture rigid as she watched the pallbearers lower her father's casket onto the mechanical lowering device. Her brother Mark lingered a few steps behind, his eyes darting between the faces in the crowd rather than focusing on the polished mahogany box that contained their father's remains. The day had started, typically enough for a funeral in small-town America. The clouds hung low and heavy, threatening rain but never quite delivering. Neighbors and friends filed in quietly, offering practiced condolences and bringing covered dishes that would inevitably end up forgotten in someone's refrigerator. Sarah had spent the morning greeting people she hadn't seen in years, accepting hugs from strangers who claimed to know Harold Thompson back when. As the local pastor began his generic sermon about life and death, Sarah found her mind wandering to memories of her father. Harold Thompson had been a fixture in the community, respected businessman, regular church attendee, annual contributor to the town's Christmas parade. Yet something about the eulogy felt hollow, as if the words were bouncing off an empty shell rather than painting a true picture of the man. Mark shifted uncomfortably beside her, checking his watch for the third time in 10 minutes. Sarah recognized his skepticism in the slight furrow of his brow, the same expression he wore whenever he thought someone wasn't telling the whole truth. She wanted to elbow him, to remind him to at least pretend to pay attention, but movement at the cemetery's entrance caught her eye. A dog, scraggly and underfed, trotted purposefully between the headstones. Its fur was a mottled brown, neither one color nor another, and its ears perked forward with determination. Sarah tried to ignore it, hoping someone would shoo it away before it disrupted the service. Instead, the animal made its way directly to Harold's casket and sat down, as if it had been invited. The pastor stumbled over his words as the dog's presence drew more attention. A few mourners shifted uncomfortably, but no one moved to remove it. The dog's behavior grew increasingly strange. It began pawing at the ground near the casket, then moved closer to scratch at the wood itself. Its whines grew louder, drowning out the pastor's attempts to continue the service. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as more heads turned toward the commotion. She glanced at Mark, expecting to see the same embarrassment, but his expression had changed. He was studying the dog with intense focus, his earlier skepticism transformed into curiosity. When George Miller, Harold's best friend of 30 years, stood to deliver his eulogy, the dog's behavior escalated. It began barking, sharp, insistent barks that echoed across the cemetery. The animal circled the casket, its claws making horrible scratching sounds against the wood. "Someone needs to remove that animal," Mrs. Peterson whispered loudly from the second row, but no one moved. There was something unsettling about the dog's determination, something that made the air feel thick with anticipation. Sarah caught Mark's eye again, and this time she recognized the look on his face. It was the same expression he'd worn as a teenager when he'd discovered their mother's old diary in the attic. The look that said he knew there was more to the story than what they were being told. The dog's barking grew more frantic, and Sarah felt something shift in the atmosphere of the gathering. What had started as an annoyance was transforming into something else, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The animal wasn't just making noise, it was trying to tell them something. As another volley of barks echoed across the cemetery, Sarah realized that this wasn't just a stray dog disrupting their father's funeral. This was the beginning of something that would force them to question everything they thought they knew about Harold Thompson. Mark stepped forward first, his hand already reaching toward the casket's lid. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I think we need to look." The gathered mourners collectively held their breath. Sarah felt their eyes on her, waiting for her response. As the eldest child, she had been making all the arrangements, handling all the decisions. This one felt different. "We can't just open it," she hissed, grabbing her brother's arm. "This isn't some mystery novel." But even as she protested, she couldn't ignore the dog's behavior. The animal had stopped barking and now stood watching them, its head cocked to one side, as if waiting for them to understand. Reverend Walsh cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess." "No," Mark interrupted, his voice firmer now. "Something's not right. Dad was acting strange those last few weeks. You noticed it too, Sarah. And now this." He gestured to the dog, which wagged its tail once at the attention. Sarah had noticed the late-night phone calls, the papers Harold had been frantically sorting through, the way he'd tried to tell her something the day before his heart attack, only to wave it off as nothing important. "Fine," she conceded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do it." Mark didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and released the first latch. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the cemetery's silence. Sarah found herself holding her breath as her brother moved to the second latch, then the third. When the lid creaked open, several people gasped. Harold Thompson's body lay exactly as the funeral home had prepared it, hands folded peacefully over his chest. But there, tucked beneath his folded hands, was something that hadn't been there during the viewing, a small tape recorder. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed. Mark reached in and carefully extracted the device. It was old, the kind that used mini cassettes, and had a piece of masking tape stuck to its side with "Play Me" written in their father's distinctive scrawl. The dog, having apparently accomplished its mission, sat down calmly beside the casket. Mark's hands shook slightly as he pressed the play button. Static crackled through the small speaker, and then Harold Thompson's voice filled the cemetery. "If you're hearing this, then I'm gone." And somehow, a dry chuckle, somehow that damn dog managed to do what I couldn't in life. "I'm sorry for the dramatics, but I needed to be sure this message reached both of you together, and I needed to be sure you'd listen." Sarah grabbed Mark's arm, her fingers digging into his suit jacket. Their father's voice continued. "There's something I never told you, something I've carried for 30 years. I convinced myself it was better this way, that silence would protect everyone involved. But I was wrong, and now I need to make it right." A long pause filled the air, punctuated only by the sound of Harold clearing his throat. "Back in 1993, while your mother was visiting her sister in Oregon, I made a terrible mistake. I had an affair. It was brief, just a few months. But," another pause, longer this time, "there was a child, a son, your brother." The tape crackled with the sound of their father's heavy breathing. Sarah felt her knees weaken, and Mark's face had gone pale. "His name is Lucas. His mother, Grace, wanted to keep him out of our lives, and I was a coward. I paid child support quietly, made sure they were taken care of, but I never acknowledged him publicly, never gave him my name, never gave him the chance to know his siblings." Murmurs rippled through the crowd of mourners. Mrs. Peterson had her hand pressed to her mouth. George Miller stared at the ground, and Sarah suddenly realized he must have known. All those fishing trips he'd taken with her father, they hadn't just been about fishing. Harold's voice grew stronger on the tape. "I tried to make it right these past few months. I found out where Lucas lives now. I wanted to tell you both about him, wanted to bring our families together, but the timing never seemed right. And now," a bitter laugh, "well, now I'm taking the coward's way out again, aren't I? Leaving this mess for you to clean up after I'm gone." The dog whined softly, as if it too were listening to Harold's confession. "There's more you need to know," Harold continued, "about why I'm telling you this now, and about what I discovered when I finally found Lucas. But first, you need to understand why I kept this secret for so long, and what it cost, not just our family, but everyone involved." The tape clicked, having reached its end. In the silence that followed, Sarah and Mark stared at each other. 30 years of family history suddenly rewriting itself in their minds. Around them, the funeral guests shifted uncomfortably, witnesses to a family secret they'd never expected to hear. The dog stood and shook itself, then looked expectantly at Sarah and Mark, as if to say its work here was done. But Sarah knew this was just the beginning. Whatever else was on that tape, whatever other secrets their father had kept, they were now part of a story that had been waiting 30 years to be told. How could he do this? Sarah's voice cut through the uncomfortable silence. The funeral crowd had dispersed, leaving the siblings alone by the casket except for the ever-present dog. All these years, all those family dinners, Christmas mornings, and he just sat there pretending everything was normal. Mark paced between the headstones, the tape recorder still clutched in his hand. Maybe that's why he was always so distant during the holidays. Remember how he'd disappear into his study after dinner, said he was doing year-end accounting, but he trailed off, reconsidering every memory through this new lens. Don't you dare make excuses for him, Sarah snapped. He lied to us, to Mum. God, Mum died never knowing about this. Did she suspect? Is that why they fought so much in the years before her cancer? Her voice cracked on the last word. The dog, which had been quietly observing their exchange, moved closer to Sarah. It pressed against her leg, offering a warmth she hadn't realized she needed. Despite her initial irritation at its presence, she found her hand automatically reaching down to touch its rough fur. We have a brother, Mark said quietly, testing the words. A whole other person who shares our blood, who grew up without us. Did he know about us? Did he watch from a distance, wondering why his father chose us over him? Sarah sank onto a nearby bench, suddenly exhausted. The dog followed, resting its head on her knee. He didn't choose us, Mark. He chose himself, his reputation, his comfortable lie. She looked at the animal, its eyes somehow understanding. How did you know? She whispered to it. How did you know about the tape? Mark sat beside her, turning the recorder over in his hands. There's more on here, Dad said so. Should we listen to the rest now? I don't know if I can handle any more revelations today. Sarah watched as the cemetery staff hovered at a respectful distance, waiting to complete their work. We need to let them finish here. She stopped, realizing she had no idea what they needed to do in this situation. The dog suddenly lifted its head, ears perked forward. It stood, took a few steps toward the cemetery gate, then looked back at them expectantly. I think, Mark said slowly, we need to find Lucas. Sarah stared at her brother. Just like that. We're going to track down our secret half-brother and what? Introduce ourselves. Hi, we're the kids Dad chose to acknowledge. Sorry about 30 years of abandonment. Want to grab coffee? Dad was trying to make it right at the end, Mark insisted. He said he found Lucas, that there was something we needed to know. Whatever else is on this tape, don't you think we owe it to both of them to at least try? The dog barked once, as if in agreement. Sarah looked from the animal to her brother, seeing the determination in his face. It was the same expression he'd worn when he decided to drop out of law school to pursue photography, despite their father's disapproval. She'd supported him then, understanding his need to forge his own path. Now he was asking her to forge another path, one that would either heal their family or shatter what was left of it. We don't even know where to start looking, she protested weakly. Mark held up the tape recorder. I think Dad left us breadcrumbs. He wouldn't have gone to all this trouble just to leave us with an impossible task. He paused, watching the dog, and I have a feeling we might have an unexpected guide. The dog wagged its tail, its whole body conveying eager anticipation. Sarah stood, brushing grass from her black dress. Every logical part of her mind told her this was crazy. They should be planning the reception, dealing with the will, handling the hundreds of practical details that death required. Instead, she heard herself say, let me change clothes first. We can listen to the rest of the tape at the house. As they walked toward their cars, the dog trotted beside them, no longer a stray, but a participant in whatever journey they were about to begin. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this animal knew more than it should, as if it had been waiting for this moment, just as their father's secret had been waiting to be revealed. "Do you think he'll want anything to do with us?" she asked quietly as they reached their vehicles. Mark opened his car door, considering, "I don't know, but I think we need to try. Not for Dad's sake, but for ours. And for Lucas. Everyone deserves to know where they come from, even if the truth isn't pretty." The dog jumped into the back seat of Mark's car without hesitation, settling in as if it had always belonged there. "I guess that answers who it's riding with," Sarah said, managing a small smile. "Follow me home." Mark nodded, but they both knew she meant more than just the drive to the house. They were about to follow a trail their father had left them, guided by a mysterious dog and a tape recording made by a dying man. It wasn't how either of them had expected to spend the day after their father's funeral. But then again, nothing about this day had gone as expected. Harold Thompson's old Victorian house loomed before them, its weathered red brick and white trim suddenly seeming like a facade hiding decades of secrets. Sarah parked in the circular driveway, remembering how proud their father had been when he'd restored the house 20 years ago. Now she wondered if the renovation had been another way to keep busy, to avoid facing his choices. Mark pulled in behind her, and the dog leaped out as soon as he opened the door. Without waiting, it trotted up the porch steps and sat by the front door, tail wagging expectantly. "Dad's study," Mark said, climbing the porch steps. "If he left any clues about Lucas, they'll be there." The study had always been Harold's sanctuary, a room that smelled of leather-bound books and pipe tobacco, even though he'd quit smoking years ago. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she inserted the key. The door swung open with a familiar creak. Everything looked exactly as it had the day Harold died. The leather chair behind his massive oak desk still held the impression of his body. Half-finished crossword puzzles lay scattered across the blotter. A coffee mug, still crusted with the remains of his last drink, sat next to a stack of manila folders. The dog went straight to the bookshelf, pawing at the lowest section where Harold kept his personal items. Mark knelt beside it, running his fingers along the spines of old photo albums and journals. "Help me look," he said, pulling out the first album. "There has to be something." Sarah moved to the desk, opening drawers she'd never dared touch while her father was alive. The top drawer held the usual office supplies, but the second, "Mark," she called, lifting out a wooden box she'd never seen before. It was about the size of a shoebox, made of dark cherry wood with brass hinges. The dog abandoned its inspection of the bookshelf and came to sit beside her as she placed the box on the desk. There was no lock, just a simple brass latch. Inside, they found a collection of items that told a story their father had kept hidden for 3 decades. Photos of a young woman with auburn hair, smiling at the camera. Letters written in flowing handwriting, dated 1993. And at the bottom, more recent items. Newspaper clippings, a business card for a diner in the neighboring town of Millbrook, and a photograph that made Sarah's breath catch. The photo showed a young man, probably in his late 20s, standing outside what looked like an auto repair shop. He had Harold's nose and jawline, and his stance, hands in pockets, slight tilt to his head, was so familiar it hurt. "That has to be Lucas," Mark whispered, taking the photo. "Look at him. He could be Dad 30 years ago." Sarah picked up one of the letters, her eyes scanning the faded ink. "Harold, I know we agreed this was for the best, but sometimes I wonder if we're making a mistake. Lucas asked about his father again today. He's only 5, but he's so perceptive. He knows there's something we're not telling him." It's signed Grace. The dog whined softly, nudging Sarah's hand with its nose. "There's more," Mark said, pulling out the business card. "Randy's Diner, Millbrook. There's writing on the back." He turned it over. "She still works here. Tuesday mornings." Almost told her everything, but couldn't find the words. The note was dated just 3 weeks ago. Sarah sank into her father's chair, the leather creaking beneath her. He was trying to reach out to them. At the very end, he was trying to make it right. "Look at this," Mark said, lifting a more recent letter from the box. The paper was crisp, the ink still fresh. "Dear Harold, I know it's been 30 years, but Lucas deserves to know the truth. Not just about you, but about everything. About why I really agreed to keep him away. About what happened that summer. He's a good man, Harold. You would be proud of him, if you let yourself be. It's signed Grace, dated last month." The dog suddenly barked, making them both jump. It pawed at the box, causing several photos to spill out. Among them was another recent one, this time showing Lucas in what appeared to be a park. He was sitting on a bench, and beside him is that. Sarah picked up the photo, staring in disbelief. "Mark, look at this. The dog in this picture with Lucas. It's the same dog, the same one that's been with us today." The dog wagged its tail, as if pleased they'd finally made the connection. Mark ran a hand through his hair, bewildered. "How is that possible? How did it know about the tape in the casket? How did it find us?" Sarah looked at the animal with new eyes. "Dad's note on the tape said the dog would somehow get the message to us. He knew. Somehow, he knew this dog would lead us to Lucas." She shuffled through more papers from the box. "There has to be something else here. Something that explains what Grace meant about everything and why she agreed to keep Lucas away." The dog barked again, then trotted to the study door, looking back at them expectantly. "I think," Mark said slowly, "it wants us to follow it to Millbrook, to Randy's diner, to Grace." Sarah gathered the photos and letters, carefully returning them to the box. "This is crazy. We're following a dog that somehow knows our long-lost brother, acting on clues left by our dead father, about to confront a woman who's kept secrets for 30 years. Crazy or not," Mark replied, "I think this is exactly what Dad planned. He knew we'd need proof before we went looking for Lucas. He knew we'd need to understand why before we could try to make things right." The dog barked once more, its message clear. It was time to go. The drive to Millbrook took 40 minutes, each mile increasing Sarah's anxiety. The dog sat calmly in Mark's back seat, occasionally catching her eye in the rearview mirror as she followed her brother's car. The wooden box sat heavy on her passenger seat, filled with 3 decades of secrets. Millbrook was smaller than their hometown, the kind of place that hadn't changed much since the 90s. The main street consisted of a handful of businesses, their paint fading in the afternoon sun. Randy's diner stood on the corner, its neon open sign buzzing faintly. "It's Tuesday," Mark said as they parked. "Dad's note said she works Tuesday mornings." The dog jumped out and waited by the diner's door, but something made Sarah hesitate. "What are we supposed to say? Hi, are you the woman our father had an affair with 30 years ago?" Inside, the diner was nearly empty. A few elderly regulars nursed coffee cups at the counter, and a teenage waitress scrolled through her phone while restocking sugar packets. Behind the counter, a woman with graying auburn hair was wiping down the coffee maker. Even after 30 years, she was recognizable from the photos in Harold's box. The dog trotted straight to her, tail wagging. The woman turned, her practiced customer service smile freezing when she saw the animal. Her eyes darted to Sarah and Mark, and the color drained from her face. "Grace." Mark stepped forward. "Grace Mitchell." The sugar packets slipped from the teenage waitress's hands, scattering across the floor. Nobody moved to pick them up. "I knew you'd come, eventually," Grace said quietly. She untied her apron with trembling hands, especially after she glanced at the dog, then back to them. "Betty, cover my tables. I'm taking my break early." She led them to a booth in the far corner, away from the curious stares of the regulars. The dog settled under the table, its head resting on Grace's feet. "You're Harold's children," she said. It wasn't a question. "Sarah and Mark. He told me about you, showed me pictures sometimes when he'd come in. He came here." Sarah's voice cracked. "How long?" Grace's hands wrapped around a coffee mug she hadn't filled. "The past few months." every Tuesday morning, like clockwork. He said he was working up the courage to tell you everything. She looked at the dog. I see Max led you here. Max. Mark followed her gaze. The dog, you know it. He's Lucas's dog, Grace explained. Has been for years. But lately, she shook her head. Lately he's been disappearing, coming back smelling like your father's pipe tobacco. I should have known Harold was planning something when Max started following him around. Sarah pulled the wooden box from her bag, setting it on the table. We found this in Dad's study. And there was a tape at the funeral. Grace touched the box lightly, as if it might burn her. He kept everything, all my letters, all the photos I sent him of Lucas growing up. He never stopped caring, even if he couldn't show it. Why? Mark leaned forward. Why agree to keep it secret? Your letter said there was more to the story, about why you really kept Lucas away. What did you mean? The afternoon sun slanted through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across their booth. Grace was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the Formica tabletop. Your mother, she finally said, was my best friend in college. Sarah felt as if all the air had been sucked from the room. Beside her, Mark went rigid. We lost touch after graduation, but when I moved here in '93, we reconnected. She invited me to dinner. That's how I met Harold. Grace's voice was barely above a whisper. The affair, it wasn't just about the affair. It was about betraying my best friend. When I found out I was pregnant, your mother had just been diagnosed with her first round of cancer. Max winced softly under the table. She was starting chemotherapy. Harold was desperate, trying to be strong for everyone. We both knew that revealing the truth then would destroy her, when she needed all her strength to fight the cancer. So we made a choice. Grace finally looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. We thought it would be temporary, just until she recovered. But then the cancer came back, Sarah finished. Again and again, for 20 years. Grace nodded. Each time we thought about telling the truth, she would get sick again. It became impossible to find the right moment. And Lucas, he grew up knowing Harold was his father, but understanding why he had to stay away. He's a good man, despite everything. Or maybe because of it. Where is he now? Mark asked. We want to meet him. Grace hesitated. He works at the auto shop down the street. But, she glanced at Max again. He's angry, not just at Harold, but at all of us who kept the secret. When your father started coming around, trying to make amends, Lucas refused to see him. Max stood suddenly, shaking himself. He padded to the diner's door, then looked back at them. I think, Grace said softly, he wants you to follow him again. But be prepared. Lucas may not want to hear what you have to say. Lucas knew about Harold his entire life. Sarah's hands gripped her coffee mug so tightly her knuckles had gone white. He watched from the sidelines while we had birthday parties, graduations, family vacations. Grace nodded slowly. I told him when he was 12. He'd been asking questions, and I couldn't lie anymore. He deserved to know why his father would show up at his little league games, but sit in the back row, never cheering. Why child support checks came in envelopes with no return address. Mark leaned back in the booth, processing. Did he ever try to contact us? Once, Grace admitted. When he was 17, he drove to your house, sat outside for hours. It was the day of your high school graduation, Sarah. He watched everyone arrive for the party, saw Harold greeting guests, being the proud father. She paused, pain evident in her expression. That was the day Lucas decided he didn't want anything to do with the Thompson family. The afternoon crowd was starting to filter into the diner, the bell above the door chiming regularly now. Max paced impatiently by the entrance. But something changed recently, Mark pressed. Dad was coming here, trying to make things right. Why now? Grace's fingers twisted her paper napkin into smaller and smaller pieces. Your mother's been gone 5 years now. The secret wasn't protecting anyone anymore, just causing more pain. And then, she hesitated. And then what? Sarah demanded. Lucas has a son now. a 6-month-old baby boy. When Harold found out he was a grandfather, Grace's voice caught. He couldn't bear the thought of another generation growing up with this wall between them. Sarah felt the world tilt slightly. Not only did they have a brother, but they had a nephew too. A baby who shared their blood, who might have Harold's nose or their mother's eyes. Max barked sharply, drawing stares from the other customers. "He's getting impatient," Grace said, managing a weak smile. "He's been doing this for months, leading Harold to Lucas, then Lucas to Harold's usual spots, like he's trying to force them to meet. Dogs sense things, you know." Max always seemed to understand the weight of all these secrets. "Did Lucas ever see Dad during these last few months?" Mark asked. Grace shook her head. "He'd leave as soon as Harold arrived. But..." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a worn envelope. "He wrote this letter, asked me to give it to Harold. I was holding on to it, waiting for the right moment. But then we heard about the heart attack." Sarah took the envelope with trembling hands. The name Harold was written in sharp, angry strokes. Max suddenly bolted from his spot by the door, racing down the sidewalk toward the auto shop visible at the end of the block. "He's leading you to Lucas," Grace said, standing. "But please, be gentle. He's had 30 years to build up walls around this pain." Mark threw some cash on the table for their coffee and stood. "What should we expect?" Grace gathered their empty mugs, her movements weighted with decades of regret. "Expect someone who has your father's stubbornness and my tendency to protect himself by pushing people away, but also someone who named his son Harold, even after everything." Sarah's head snapped up. "He named his baby Harold. Some hurts run so deep they circle back around to love," Grace said quietly. "Lucas may act like he wants nothing to do with the Thompson family, but he gave his son that name for a reason." Outside, Max's barking echoed down the street. Sarah clutched Lucas's unopened letter in one hand and the wooden box of memories in the other. They were about to meet their brother, a stranger who had watched their lives from a distance, who had grown up in the shadows of their family's happiness, who had every right to slam the door in their faces. "Wait," Grace called as they reached the door. "There's something else you should know." The reason Max was able to find that tape in the casket. She paused, as if weighing whether to continue. Lucas was at the funeral home the night before. He came to say goodbye to Harold, but he was too late. The dog must have seen him hide something in the casket. Sarah and Mark exchanged looks. Had their brother been the one to place the tape? Had this entire trail of breadcrumbs been laid by both Harold and Lucas, each reaching out in their own way? Max's insistent barking grew louder. "Go," Grace said softly. "But remember, sometimes the hardest walls to break down are the ones people build to protect themselves from hope." The auto shop stood at the far end of Main Street, its weathered sign reading Lucas Mitchell's Auto Repair in faded blue letters. Max sat expectantly by the open garage bay, where the steady rhythm of metal on metal indicated someone working inside. Sarah's footsteps slowed as they approached. Through the gap, she could see a man bent over the engine of an old Ford pickup. Even from behind, the resemblance to Harold was striking. The same broad shoulders, the same way of standing with weight shifted slightly to the left. Max barked once, and the man stiffened. The wrench in his hand paused mid-turn. "Whatever she told you at the diner," he said without turning round, his voice deeper than they'd imagined. "It doesn't change anything." Mark stepped forward. "Lucas, we're not here to..." "To what?" Lucas finally turned, wiping his hands on a red shop rag. The motion was so familiar. Harold had always kept a similar rag in his workshop that Sarah felt her throat tighten. To make amends, to create one big happy family. He had 30 years to do that. Up close, the resemblance was even more startling. Lucas had their father's eyes, the same steel gray that could turn stormy with emotion. But there was something else there too, a hardness that Harold had never shown. "We only found out today," Sarah said quietly. "At the funeral, there was a tape. I know about the tape." Lucas tossed the rag onto a nearby workbench. "I'm the one who put it there." Found it in his regular booth at Randy's after. He swallowed hard. After they called about the heart attack, he'd been leaving things like that around town for weeks. Little messages, photos, pieces of the past he suddenly wanted to share. Max padded over to Lucas, leaning against his leg. The gesture seemed to deflate some of his anger. "Why did you put it in the casket?" Mark asked. "Why not just tell us yourself?" Lucas ran a hand through his hair. Another gesture so like Harold it hurt. Because he needed to be the one to tell you. One last act of courage from a coward. He looked at Max. "Though I didn't expect this mutt to make such a production of revealing it. Grace told us about your son," Sarah ventured. "About little Harold." Something flickered across Lucas's face. Pain, pride, fear, all mixed together. "That was Grace's doing, telling you about him." "I didn't want." He stopped, collecting himself. "My son has nothing to do with this." "He has everything to do with this," Mark countered. "He's our nephew. He's part of our family, just like you are." "Family?" Lucas laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I watched my family from parking lots and back rows of auditoriums. I saw every Christmas light go up on your house, every birthday balloon tied to your mailbox. I know which window was yours, Sarah. Second floor, left side. The one with the purple curtains you hung in high school. And yours, Mark. Ground floor, near the oak tree you used to sneak out of." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. How many nights had he watched their lives unfold, like scenes from a play he couldn't join? "You want to know what family means to me?" Lucas continued, his voice getting louder. "It means watching Harold Thompson be Father of the Year, while my mother worked double shifts. It means learning to hate the sound of his car engine, because it meant another drive-by viewing of his real family. It means he stopped abruptly, as a cry echoed from the small office at the back of the shop. Through the office window, they could see a baby carrier, and in it, a small figure beginning to fuss." The transformation in Lucas was immediate. His shoulders softened, the anger draining from his posture. "I need to go," Sarah said softly. "We'll wait." They watched as Lucas disappeared into the office, returning moments later with a baby boy cradled against his chest. Little Harold had Lucas's dark hair, but, somehow, their mother's gentle features. "He's beautiful," Mark whispered. Lucas looked down at his son, and for a moment, his defenses seemed to crack. "He's the reason I finally wrote that letter to Harold. The one Grace has, I thought. I thought maybe it was time to stop letting the past poison the future." He glanced up at them, but then he died, and all those chances died with him. "No," Sarah said, taking a step forward. "The chances don't die with him. They live with us, with you, with this little boy who deserves to know all of his family." Sarah moved closer, her eyes fixed on the baby. "Dad told us, in the tape, that he tried to make things right these past few months. That there was more we needed to know." She pulled out the wooden box. "We found this in his study. 30 years of you growing up, Lucas. Every school photo, every achievement, every milestone. He kept them all." Lucas shifted the baby to his other shoulder, his expression guarded. "Keeping photos in a box isn't the same as being there." "No, it's not," Mark agreed. "Nothing excuses what he did. But he was trying, at the end. Grace said you knew he was coming to the diner, that you'd leave when you saw him coming. What was I supposed to do?" Lucas's voice cracked slightly. "Sit down and have coffee with him. Listen to him explain why he chose his reputation over his son, why he could only be a father from a distance." The baby stirred at his rising tone, and Lucas automatically began swaying, a father's instinct to soothe. Sarah opened the box, pulling out a recent photo. "This was taken 2 months ago. You're holding little Harold on that bench in the park. Dad must have been watching from somewhere nearby." Lucas took the photo with his free hand, studying it. "I knew he was there. I always knew when he was watching, just like when I was a kid." He touched his son's head gently. "That day, I almost called out to him. Little Harold had just learned to smile, really smile, and I thought." He shook his head. but old habits die hard. Max wins softly, moving to sit between Lucas and his siblings, creating a bridge in the space that divided them. "When did you start hoping things could be different?" Mark asked quietly. "Was it when your son was born?" Lucas was silent for a long moment, just rocking his baby boy. "It was before that," he finally said. "The day of Mum's funeral, your mum's funeral. I saw how broken Harold was, how the secret had eaten away at him all those years. I realized I was carrying the same weight, the same anger, and I didn't want my child to inherit that burden." Sarah stepped closer, close enough now to see her nephew's sleeping face clearly. "Lucas, we can't change the past. We can't give you back those 30 years. But we're here now, standing in front of you, asking to be part of your future, part of little Harold's future." The baby chose that moment to open his eyes, Harold's eyes, the same steel gray that now looked back at them from Lucas's face. He blinked at Sarah, and then, remarkably, smiled. Lucas's breath caught. "He doesn't smile at strangers," he whispered. "Maybe he knows," Mark suggested softly. "Maybe he knows we're family." Max barked once, tail wagging, and little Harold turned toward the sound with another smile. The dog had been their guide, their bridge between past and present. And now it seemed to be sealing something, bringing them full circle. "The letter," Lucas said suddenly. "The one I wrote to Harold. Did Grace give it to you?" Sarah pulled it from her purse, still unopened. "We haven't read it." "Read it," Lucas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Read it now, out loud. He never got to hear it, but maybe you should." With trembling fingers, Sarah opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. The paper was wrinkled, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times before being sealed away. She began to read. "Harold, for 30 years, I've rehearsed what I would say to you if I ever got the chance. I've written this letter 100 times in my head. But now that I'm actually writing it, the only thing I can think to say is, I named my son after you. Not because you were a good father to me. You weren't. Not because you deserve to be honored. You don't. I named him Harold because despite everything, despite the anger and the pain and the years of watching from a distance, I never stopped wanting you to be proud of me. And I want my son to know that even complicated love is still love, that even broken things can be beautiful in their own way. I'm not ready to forgive you. I might never be. But I'm ready to stop letting our past determine my son's future." Sarah's voice faltered as she continued reading. "My son deserves to know his family, all of them. He deserves to know Sarah, who used to leave cookies for the mailman every Christmas, just like Mum told me she did. He deserves to know Mark, who fought to become a photographer despite everything, just like I fought to open this garage. He deserves more than whispered stories and stolen glances. I'm not writing this for you, Harold. I'm writing it for him, for all the future Harolds who shouldn't have to inherit our silence." "Lucas," the letter trembled in Sarah's hands. Mark had moved closer, one hand on her shoulder. Lucas stood frozen, his son sleeping peacefully against his chest, unaware of the weight of the moment. "How did you know about the cookies?" Sarah whispered. "About Mark's photography." Lucas shifted uncomfortably. "I told you, I watched. Every Christmas, every milestone. Mom, Grace, she'd tell me stories too, things she heard from people in town. I knew when you got into Yale, Sarah, when you dropped out of law school. Mark, I knew when your mum got sick each time, and I'd see Harold at church, praying. I knew everything, just from the wrong side of the window." Max nudged Lucas's leg, and for the first time, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "This dog," he said, shaking his head. "He started disappearing months ago. I'd find him at Randy's when Harold was there, or at the park. It was like he was trying to tell me something. Then, the day Harold died, he swallowed hard. Max came home with Harold's old pipe in his mouth, must have taken it from the diner. That's when I knew I had to do something, even if it was too late." "It's not too late," Mark said firmly. "Look at him." He gestured to little Harold. "He's proof that it's not too late." The baby stirred, making small snuffling noises. Without thinking, Sarah reached out, her hand hovering near the child's tiny fingers. Lucas didn't pull away. Little Harold grabbed her finger, his grip surprisingly strong. "He has Mum's hands," Lucas said softly. "Grace showed me pictures. The same long fingers." "Dad kept everything," Sarah told him, still marveling at her nephew's grip. "Every letter Grace wrote, every photo. There's 30 years of you in this box, Lucas. 30 years of a father who was too scared to do the right thing, but who never stopped loving you from afar." "Love isn't supposed to be from afar," Lucas countered, but his voice had lost its earlier edge. "No," Mark agreed. "It's not. But maybe that's why we're here now. Maybe that's why Max led us to you, to bring it all closer." The dog wagged its tail, looking between them as if confirming Mark's words. "I have albums," Sarah said suddenly. "Photos of us growing up, of Mum, of everything. If you want, if you'd like to see them sometime, not to make up for what you missed, but to fill in the gaps, to know the whole story." Lucas looked down at his son, then at Max, then finally at his siblings. "I spent so many years being angry," he said quietly, "building walls, keeping my distance. But then this little guy came along, and suddenly all those walls felt more like cages. Keeping things out, sure, but also keeping us in." The baby cooed, releasing Sarah's finger to wave his tiny fist in the air. "Maybe," Lucas continued, his voice thick with emotion, "maybe it's time to let the walls come down. Not for Harold, our father, not even for us, but for him, for little Harold. So he never has to wonder about his family, never has to watch from a distance." "There's something else," Lucas said, shifting little Harold to reach into his back pocket. He pulled out another tape, similar to the one from the funeral. "I found this at Randy's too. Dad left it the morning before." He cleared his throat. "I haven't been able to listen to it yet. Haven't been ready." Sarah looked at the tape, then at Max, who sat alertly watching them. "Maybe it's time we all heard it." Mark pulled an old portable tape player from the wooden box. Harold had clearly planned for this moment, ensuring they'd have everything they needed to piece together his final messages. Lucas's hands shook slightly as he inserted the tape. Little Harold stirred, blinking up at them with curious grey eyes as the static crackled through the speaker. Then Harold Thompson's voice filled the garage, stronger than in the funeral recording, but heavy with emotion. "Lucas, my son, if you're hearing this, then either I finally found the courage to give you this tape in person, or time ran out for me. I'm sitting in Randy's right now, watching you work through the window of your shop. Your son, my grandson, is sleeping in his carrier beside your desk. He looks so much like you did at that age. I've spent 30 years protecting a secret that only caused pain. I told myself it was for your mother's sake, for Sarah and Mark's sake, for the sake of appearances. But the truth is, I was a coward. Every time I saw you growing up, every game I watched from the back row, every graduation I glimpsed from my parked car down the street, each time I told myself, next time, I'll make it right. But what I never told anyone, what I couldn't admit, even to myself, until I saw you with your own son, was that my greatest fear wasn't scandal or judgment. It was that you would reject me, that you would look at me with the same disappointment I saw in the mirror every morning. And so I kept my distance, thinking it was better to be a ghost in your life than to face the consequences of my choices. I was wrong, God. I was wrong for so long." They heard Harold take a shaky breath on the recording. In Lucas's arms, little Harold reached toward the sound of his grandfather's voice. "I've left another tape, one that will bring your siblings to you. Because you deserve to know them, Lucas, and they deserve to know you. Sarah has your mother's compassion, and Mark has your determination. They're good people, despite having a father who lived a lie. And that little boy you're raising, my grandson, little Harold, thank you. Thank you for giving him my name, even though I never gave you mine properly. Thank you for being a better father than I ever was. Thank you for breaking the cycle of silence. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve to ask for it, but I want you to know that I loved you every day, from the moment Grace told me she was pregnant. I loved you through every missed birthday, every distant Christmas, every silent anniversary. I loved you wrong, but I loved you completely. Max is sitting here with me now, like he does every Tuesday morning. This dog of yours, son, he's been trying to tell us something all along. That love doesn't know boundaries, that family finds a way, that it's never too late to start healing. I hope someday you'll share this tape with Sarah and Mark. I hope someday you'll all understand that the biggest secrets aren't the ones we keep from others, but the ones we keep from ourselves. The secret I kept from myself was that I never stopped being your father, even when I stopped acting like one. I love you, Lucas. I love your son. And I'm sorry, not just for what I did, but for all the years I wasted not making it right. The tape clicked off, leaving them in silence, broken only by little Harold's soft coos. Max moved between them, touching each of them in turn. Sarah, Mark, Lucas, and finally the baby, as if completing a circle that had taken 30 years to close. Lucas looked down at his son, then at his siblings. I spent so many years watching your lives through windows, he said quietly. Maybe it's time I learned what it feels like to be on the same side of the glass. Sarah wiped her eyes. We can start now. Stay for dinner, both of you. She glanced at little Harold. All of you. Mark nodded eagerly. We could order from Randy's, share stories, start filling in 30 years of blanks. Lucas was quiet for a moment, looking at Max, who wagged his tail expectantly. Finally, he nodded. Yeah, he said softly. Yeah, I think it's time. Time to stop watching from a distance. Time to start being a family. Max barked once, as if in agreement, and little Harold laughed, a pure, innocent sound that seemed to wash away decades of pain and secrets. In that moment, as sunset painted the garage in shades of gold, they weren't the children of a man who had lived 2 lives, but simply a family finding its way back to wholeness, guided by a dog who had known all along that love was stronger than silence.